Here. Good evening. My name's John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. In honor of our men and women who defend our freedom around the world in uniform, if you please stand and join me with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. Before we get started, there's a couple people that I think are important to recognize this evening, and I'll start with President Reagan's son, Michael Reagan. Michael. Thanks for coming, Michael. And we also have with us another special guest, represented the congressional district that holds the Reagan Library for 26 years, Congressman Elton Galgley and his wife Janice. Thanks for joining us, Elton. Okay, so this morning on the way to work, I stopped at a local store and I bought for our guest, Bret Baier, a lottery ticket. Now, I know that might sound strange, so let me explain. I've no doubt that most, if not all of you, have heard the old adage about how luck, it doesn't just happen to us. We all make our own luck. It's someone's hard work or their perseverance or their smarts that positions them in such a way that they are in the right place at the right time, and then great things happen. So I'm a steadfast believer that we make our own luck. Now take, for example, our guest, Bret. Talk about lucky. A while ago, he got an idea to write a book about a fascinating man, Ronald Reagan, who had a dream, a vision really, about how the end of communism was within sight. President Reagan had the foresight and the courage to call the scourge of communism exactly what it was, evil. And he set about to take advantage of a special moment in time to use all his power to bring it to an end. It's the subject which Bret decided to write about in his very special and insightful book, 3 Days in Moscow, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of the Soviet Empire. Now, there was no serendipity involved in the tremendous research and the skill that Bret brought to bear in bringing this best-selling book about. Like I said, it was hard work and persistence and smarts on his part that made the book a reality. But is he lucky too? About 2 weeks before Bret's book was published, another president, this one by the name of Donald Trump, got word that North Korea, another despot regime, very much like the communist Soviet Union during Reagan's time, was willing to sit down, unbelievably enough, and talk about the possible denuclearization of his own country. Now, the similarities between Ronald Reagan's challenge, which Bret has so skillfully related, and our present threat from North Korea are so striking that one has to wonder whether Kim Jong-un announced his interest in a summit with President Trump so that its timing would coincide with the publication of Bret's book. Surely I jest, but it is fascinating to see the leaders, Reagan and Trump, separated by 3 decades in time with such remarkable similarities in circumstances. The stakes for each, Reagan and Trump, well, the security for all Americans. Reagan and Trump, outsiders in their own political party, whose provocative words towards America's enemies led many to believe that nuclear war might be possible. Reagan declared the Soviets an evil empire. Trump denounces the little rocket man. Gorbachev and Kim Jong-un, each flirting with options to suggest peace. Gorbachev agrees to Reagan's zero option to denuclearize Europe. Un suggests denuclearizing his own state. Reagan and Trump, capitalists representing the greatest democracy on the planet. Gorbachev and Un, communists representing failing economic states. It was June 12, 1987, when Ronald Reagan urged Gorbachev to tear down this wall. On June 12th, just 3 decades later and only 3 weeks from today, Donald Trump is scheduled to meet with Kim Jong-un, asking him to tear down these rockets, dismantle these missiles. Bret, we will have to get Sean Hannity to work on a good line. In any event, the timing of the release of Bret's fantastic new book couldn't be better. Call it perfect timing, call it just sheer brilliance on his part. But just in case it really is luck, like I said, I bought him this lottery ticket because there's the distinct possibility he's on a lucky streak. The Powerball prize is $40 million, and the deal is if he wins, I get half. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming, lucky or not, a true winner, Fox's chief political anchor, Mr. Bret Baier.
Yeah, that was great, John. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very nice. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is good. I'm feeling good about this. I did spend some time in the DMZ, so maybe my message across the line there worked. You know, schedule it now. Michael, great to see you. Congressman, thanks for being here. All of you, thank you for coming out today. This is a real pleasure for me and kind of a culmination of a journey that started right here. And I'll talk a little bit about the formation of this and kind of my thought process in going in and what I learned throughout this process. This is the third book that I'm talking about here from this very podium. My first one, Special Heart, a journey of faith, hope, courage, and love about my son, Paul, who had 3 open heart surgeries and 9 angioplasties. Today was climbing through the Berlin Wall over here in the exhibit with his brother Daniel. He's doing fantastic. By the way, he's the tallest kid in his class. He plays golf. The plastic clubs in the crib worked. And he is the student council president of the 4th grade of his class, so he's doing well. And I want to apologize to the docent because he asked about 7 billion questions today. I know they get paid by the hour, not by the question here, so thank you very much. They had a blast touring this museum today. The second book was 3 Days in January, which I was very lucky to talk about here to you all, Dwight Eisenhower's final mission. And actually, I write about that speech in the foreword to this book, about telling the folks here about what I learned in the 3 years of research about Eisenhower, how I came to kind of find President Eisenhower and use those 3 days in the final days of his administration before the Kennedy inauguration and his farewell address to jump back and look at Eisenhower's life and how he gets to those moments. And that speech here kind of really got me going about finding another moment in time, another speech that maybe at the time was overlooked contemporaneously, but looking back was a seminal moment that changed the world. And I found it after working with the great folks here and the people holding the oral histories in the University of Virginia, interviewing people like the great George Shultz, who at 97 remembers meetings like they were yesterday. It's truly, truly amazing. Interviewed a ton of folks for this book, and there will be actually an hour special, a documentary that'll air June 15th, that weekend, Father's Day weekend, about this book and all of the interviews that we did for it. So really excited about showing you that as well. But I used that template of the 3 days, looking at a soda straw and kind of using the details and nuggets that hadn't come out before, and jumping back to show how Reagan gets to that point in his life, which was just an amazing moment in time. Now, as opposed to Eisenhower, I had a personal relationship to this book. You may remember, I don't know if any of you were here for that speech I gave, but the reason I found Eisenhower is because I'm a golfer, and I was invited to play Augusta National, and I stayed at the Eisenhower cabin. And that was kind of I had 1 or 2 glasses of wine, maybe 3, and I walked around the Eisenhower cabin and found kind of the spirit of Eisenhower, which kind of drove me to go eventually to Abilene, Kansas, and really research about Ike. Well, in this case, I'd already come to the conclusion of what I wanted to do, but the personal connection was far more personal. In 1987, I was a senior at Marist School in Atlanta. I was the student council president of my high school, and I was asked to accompany the headmaster to Washington to accept an award for the school, a school of excellence, and we were being honored at the White House. So I went to the Rose Garden and with other schools and their leaders, and in walks President Reagan with his then Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett. And they had a wonderful event in the Rose Garden where they acknowledged all the excellent schools, and I was really fortunate to be there. And I was soaking it all in and kind of looking at the Rose Garden and the White House and the big press pool and thinking, wow, this is just amazing. As he finishes up, he was walking back to the Oval Office, and at the time, the Robert Bork nomination for the Supreme Court was having a tough time in the Senate. And as he's walking back, Sam Donaldson with ABC yells, "Mr. President, the Bork nomination, it doesn't look like it's getting out of committee. Will it get out of committee?" And Reagan turns around and says, or will it die in committee? And Reagan turns around and says, "Over my dead body." And turns around, and then Donaldson is yelling more questions at him. Okay, so I'm a senior in high school, student council president, also sports editor of the paper, and I am so incensed by the rudeness of the press. So incensed that I go back to Atlanta and I pen this op-ed, and I am just livid. And and I write about it in the intro here, and I say, and I titled the op-ed, "Press Needs Etiquette." The press has to respect others around them. They had no right to come into that ceremony and be obnoxious by yelling questions at the president as he walked away. I understand that they do need some way to get the stories, but I think that respect has a lot to do with it. And it was a big, long thing, okay? Fast forward, exactly 20 years. Chief White House correspondent Bret Baier is in the exact same Rose Garden yelling questions at George W. Bush about the Iraq War. Fast forward from that point, exactly 10 years, and anchor of Special Report Bret Baier is inviting Bill Bennett on the panel to discuss the politics of the day. So it all comes full circle here. And that was my personal connection that I wanted to intro in the foreword to this book. What the book represents to me is the realization that Reagan always knew. He always knew inherently that communism was not going to work, that it was morally bankrupt and ethically bankrupt and eventually would be economically bankrupt. And you see more than anything throughout his life that that is inherent in his principle in almost everything he does and talks about. Back to the time when he's the president of the Screen Actors Guild. And in Hollywood, all of the threat of communism and the scare was happening. And he's going to Capitol Hill to testify. But he's really aggressively fighting the communist threat. By the way, incidentally, that is when he meets Nancy Davis, because she is listed as one of the communist sympathizers, but it's the wrong Nancy Davis who's listed. And she goes through someone to get to the Screen Actors Guild president to say, it's not me. And she, at the time, says, I really need to talk about it with the handsome bachelor who is the Screen Actors Guild president. And eventually they meet and they have dinner, and that is the beginning of their relationship. Just an interesting aside. There's a lot of interesting asides in the book, little nuggets that I think may be overlooked at the time when you look at them. I think you look at every race that Reagan ran, and it had to do something with communism or fighting it or standing up on principle. Fast forward to, he becomes governor here. It's a factor, not the factor. He runs for president. In 1984, the biggest ad that got the most attention was an ad with, you may remember this, a giant grizzly bear running through the forest. And the bear is running, lumbering through, and an announcer's voice is very calm, low voice that says, there is a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see. Others don't see it at all. Some people say the bear is tame. Others say it's vicious and dangerous. Since no one can really be sure who's right, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear. That was the end of the commercial. So the bear, obviously, is the Soviet Union and communism on the march. But that was the commercial, and everybody's looking at it like, so is there a bear? But it was effective because inherently he saw it as a real threat that had to be confronted. Well, he speaks about this throughout his life, obviously, but especially when he's president of the United States. And he is not meeting with the Soviet leaders who, one after another, he said, they're all dying on me. They did, actually. But he didn't want to put them on the same playing field until there was Mikhail Gorbachev, who opened the door to the possibility. Remember the speeches that were delivered along the way. Communism will be on the ash heap of history. The Soviet Union is the evil empire. Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, June 12, 1987. Those are things at the time that the foreign policy establishment was saying, this guy's a warmonger. This is too inflammatory. You can't say this. This is going to end negotiations. Remember, the policy at the time before that was détente. Well, Reagan was having no part of it. And he was, on the tear down this wall speech, there must have been 10 people inside the White House at the State Department who wanted to take that line out. They kept on taking it out. And it was a Reagan line. It was on his yellow pads that he worked on with the speechwriters. The one thing I realized researching this from the beginning was how active Reagan was in writing and working on those speeches. Like Eisenhower, he was really a factor in the speechwriting. He wrote his Saturday morning addresses himself, but he was active in the big speeches as well. So 10 people are saying, you cannot have this phrase. So as they're heading to Berlin, it's out of the speech. And we found this conversation between Reagan and an aide in the limo heading to the speech. And Reagan says, well, the boys at State are going to kill me. but it's the right thing to do. Putting it back in. That's my best Reagan. So, Michael, is that all right? He's raising his eyebrows like, no, that's not that good. And he put it back in. And it was in the speech and obviously became an iconic moment that everybody looks back at. I think when you look at Reagan as a person, some of the stories are just truly amazing about his humility and his ability to connect with people. You'd ask people, at the time why they liked Reagan, and some of them would come back with the same line, and that's because he likes me. You could feel the humanity or the humility with Reagan. Just an example. So the summits go Geneva, Reykjavik, Washington, and then Moscow. Geneva, they are setting up for this big moment, the first meeting. And they get a house from Aga Khan. He's the bigwig in Geneva, if you will. He's got a couple of big chateaus. They're going to hold the meeting in one of them, and they're going to put the Reagans up in another. But the one caveat is that the Reagans had to agree to feed the goldfish of their 11-year-old son. And they get there, and on the second day, and Reagan is really taking care to feed the goldfish. He's very concerned about it. Second day, he calls Don Reagan in and says, Don, I've got a problem. The goldfish died. And they went out and got 2 other goldfish. And he wrote a very heartwarming note to the 11-year-old boy in the middle of a summit with the leader of the Soviet Union. The beginning of that summit was a real iconic moment, because here's the first time they're getting together. And the world, at least the foreign policy establishment back in D.C., is playing it like maybe Reagan is going to get rolled. Maybe, the old man is off a step. It's essentially what the media was saying. And Mikhail Gorbachev at the time was a rock star. He was being received around the world as the new up-and-comer, and he was engaging in Europe. So the moment that they meet, Reagan comes out of the chateau, sort of like it's his own, and is not wearing a jacket. It is super cold. He's just in a suit, a tailored suit, blue pinstripe. I think it's in the museum here. Comes out, looks like $1 million. In comes this lumbering Soviet kind of limo, big limo. Out comes Gorbachev, bundled, huddled. He's got the hat and a giant scarf and a big winter jacket. And then the image of the svelte, handsome, pinstripe suit wearing Reagan and the huddled Soviet leader. And as they're walking up the stairs, Reagan even helps him on the arm, like you can make it up the stairs. Welcome to my chateau. And the image was just amazing. It turned the whole thing around, and you realize how much that really factored in to the perception. When he gets inside, Reagan was really great about having jokes and themes, and you would have 3x5 cards and 4x6 cards in his Oval Office desk with a bunch of a lot of them were corny jokes and kind of dad jokes, sort of, but they really worked to diffuse the room. So he helps Gorbachev into Geneva. They get through the door, and remember, this is the first meeting. And he turns to him and he says, I like the one about the American and the Russian together. And the American says, it's really good because I can go to the White House and say Ronald Reagan is doing a lousy job. And the Russian says, well, you know what? I can do the same thing. I can go to the Kremlin and say Ronald Reagan is doing a lousy job. And Gorbachev doesn't even know how to read that. He just kind of smirks. And you read the internal dynamics between the two men, and you can imagine Gorbachev kind of rolling his eyes like, oh, here's another one. Do you hear the one about the communist lottery? They just started. Get $1 million. $1 a year for 1 million years. There's a lot of them. A lot of them. Anyway, so then they go to Reykjavik, and that is really the moment where they are really at loggerheads, primarily over SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars back here. The reporters and those covering it in Washington called it pie in the sky, like it was a cartoon game that came out of nowhere and didn't know it was, you know, how real is this? This is ridiculous. But on the other side of the table, the Soviets saw it as a real threat, one that they would have to spend and spend and spend to try to defeat. And it became the sticking point in Reykjavik, to the point where they got up off the table, and essentially it was almost done. They weren't sure whether there was going to be another meeting. Eventually, the two sides decided to meet again in Washington. And that was a big moment because Mikhail Gorbachev was coming to D.C. And as President Reagan is waiting at the White House, there is another cable network that had just started covering things live, another 3 letters that I don't like to say. They were actively live covering the event, and Reagan is actually watching this live, and Gorbachev is running late. Well, he stops, Gorbachev does, with Reza, his wife, on Connecticut Avenue, and gets out of the vehicle and starts working the cafes along Connecticut Avenue. I mean, really working it like an American politician, like he's in the Iowa caucuses or something, and kissing babies and shaking hands, and people are yelling, "Gorby, Gorby, we love you." And the image was quite something as he's making his way to the White House. And finally, he's 30 minutes late to pull up to the portico, and Reagan says, "Well, looks like you like Washington." And that was the beginning of the Washington moment. Fast forward to Moscow, the final summit. And this is a big moment because the first time the American president is going to the heart of communism. And he lands, he stops in Helsinki on the way, lands, and there's a big welcoming ceremony. And they make it to where they're staying at the Spaso house, where Nancy Reagan and President Reagan are staying. They come down and they say to the Secret Service, "We'd like to go out and meet the people." And the Secret Service says, "What?" "We'd like to go meet the people." And there's a square just down the road. It's called the Arbat. It's about 300 yards away. It's an open market with different carts and kiosks. And you can imagine the Secret Service wheels going, like, how are we going to secure this? And they argue about it and say, we don't have this, we didn't tell the KGB or the Moscow police, we don't have any setup. There are apartment buildings all surrounding the Arbat full of windows, and you don't know who's going to be there. And Nancy Reagan says, "We're going to go in 15 minutes. And can you make it happen?" And he says, "Yes, ma'am, we can." So they mobilize, and in 15 minutes, they tell Marlon Fitzwater, the press secretary, the press pool is going to get together, and they're like a group of ducklings, you know, waddling along behind Fitzwater, and they're going to go the 200 yards to the Arbat. Well, they get in a limo to drive the 200 yards, and they get out, and they walk out, and suddenly hundreds of people from all over start crowding in and yelling, "President Reagan, President Reagan." And the Secret Service is trying to create a bubble around them, and it's just becoming kind of chaotic. And Reagan, grabs Nancy and steps up onto a vegetable cart because they're yelling, "We can't see you." And he gets up on the vegetable cart, and Nancy's at his side, and he says, "We just wanted to say hello, and it's great to be in Moscow, and this is an example of freedom, getting together, freedom to get together." And he's talking to the people, they're cheering, you can barely hear them, and more people are flooding into the Arbat. Well, now the KGB arrives, and they are forming this circle. The Secret Service is like at the protective circle, and then the KGB is right outside. It's getting really, really chaotic, and the KGB starts beating people off. In fact, some reporters fell down. They got pushed into garbage cans. Helen Thomas with UPI, she was 67 at the time, and she had been a little aggressive in her reporting of the Reagans for quite some time. And she was there, and she was kind of outside the bubble, and it's getting chaotic, and they're moving back, and the Secret Service says, we've got to go. So they start to move everybody back to the Spaso house 200 yards away. Nancy Reagan turns and sees that Helen Thomas is outside the bubble. She's getting pushed around. She says, she's with us. And she grabs Helen Thomas and pulls her into the bubble, and they finally all get into the Spaso house, and there is this exhale, like a giant exhale, like, whew. And Nancy Reagan turns and looks to Marlon Fitzwater and says, well, Marlon, what'd you think? And Marlon doesn't miss a beat, and he says, we just lost our last best chance to get rid of Helen Thomas. True story. So, Gorbachev and Reagan had an amazing relationship that established over time. It was not all wonderful. They were at loggerheads at some times, Reykjavik and other times, where they just said niet to each other and walked off the table. But in Moscow, they had a wonderful moment where they had established this friendship, and Reagan is meeting privately with him after the photo op moves on, and he gives Gorbachev a denim jacket. And Gorbachev holds it up and says, is this my size? And he says, I don't know, but it's good. And Reagan gets a gift of a model of the Kremlin. I don't know what he's going to do with that, but he says, thank you very much. And Gorbachev says, but here is my biggest gift. And he brings out this stack of papers. These are messages and letters and wires that were going through the Kremlin to the White House to mark, from Soviet citizens, to mark the arrival of President Reagan and Nancy Reagan. And Gorbachev starts reading them, and he says, our baby daughter, weighing 3,100 grams, was born on May 28th, the eve of your first visit to our country. With best of attentions, we wish to name her Reagan Anna. Your surname with the addition of an Anna. We want to tell you about this and request your consent. We are happy, another one, about your arrival. We had just had a baby girl. We ask your permission to name her Nancy. Esteemed Mr. President, on the eve of your arrival in the Soviet Union, our son was born as a sign of strengthening friendship between the peoples of the USSR and the USA. We have decided to name our son Ronald. We invite you to become the godfather to our son. On the day of your arrival in our country, a day of historical importance, our baby daughter was born. We have decided to name her Nancy in honor of your wife. We wish you productive work and success in your talks for the good of the whole world. And they laughed together and just had a wonderful moment. And Reagan said he was not sure after the Washington-Connecticut Avenue deal how many races and Gorbies there were in the U.S. That were born at that time. The thing I really took away from this was that this was a seminal speech at Moscow State University, where he, on May 31st, 1988, again, 30 years ago this month, is talking to students, the future of the Soviet Union, about freedom. Not in a way that is, our system is better than your system, but in a way of being a Pied Piper for freedom. Like, this is the way you need to go for the future. When they arrived in Moscow, the speechwriter, Josh Gilder, wanted to go see the site. And he goes to Moscow State University, where the speech is going to happen only a couple of hours later. And he notices that the podium is under a giant bust of Vladimir Lenin, and next to a mural of the revolution. And he's sweating, thinking, oh my gosh, this image is going to be horrific. And he says, can you move that? And they're like, no. So then he sits there and he thinks about it, and he calls Marlon Fitzwater, and he says, "You're not going to believe this." And Fitzler, he's turning white when he hears this. But then they collectively say, maybe this is exactly the image that President Reagan would want. And they write it into the top of the speech. "I'm standing in front of a mural of your revolution." The speech, if you go back and you Google it and you watch on YouTube, it will give you goosebumps today. It is as relevant today as it was back then. You insert some different words. It's similar to the Eisenhower farewell address in that it plays whenever you play it. And his delivery and ability to really connect, he used Russian poets and proverbs and songs to connect with these kids, to have a real message. And I just want to read a couple of sentences, and I do want to take your questions too, fair and balanced across the board. I want to talk to you not just of the realities of today, but the possibilities of tomorrow. Standing here before a mural of your revolution, I want to talk about a very different revolution that's taking place right now, quietly sweeping the globe without bloodshed or conflict. Its effects are peaceful, but they will fundamentally alter our world, shatter our assumptions, and reshape our lives. It's easy to underestimate because it's not accompanied by banners or fanfare. It's been called the technological or information revolution. And its emblem, one might take, is the tiny silicon chip, no bigger than a fingerprint. One of those chips has more computing power than a room full of old-style computers. He said the key to success is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of information, freedom of communication. The renowned scientist, scholar, and founding father of this university, Mikhail Lomonosov, knew that, quote, "It's common knowledge," he said, "that the achievements of science are considerable and rapid, particularly once the yoke of slavery is cast off and replaced by freedom of philosophy." Going on, he says, "Freedom is the right to question and change the established way of doing things. It is the continuing revolution of the marketplace. It is the understanding that allows us to recognize shortcomings and seek solutions. It is the right to put forth an idea scoffed at by the experts and to watch it catch fire among the people. It is the right to dream, to follow your dream, or stick to your conscience, even if you're the only one in a sea of doubters. Freedom is the recognition that no single person, no single authority or government has a monopoly on the truth, but that every individual life is infinitely precious, that every one of us put on this world has been put there for a reason and has something to offer." And he ends in this speech that is really gripping these students. "In this Moscow spring, this May 1988, we may be allowed that hope, that freedom, like the fresh green sapling planted over Tolstoy's grave, will blossom forth at last in the rich, fertile soil of your people and culture. We may be allowed to hope that the marvelous sound of a new openness will keep rising through, ringing through, leading to a new world of reconciliation, friendship, and peace." I mean, just those graphs are just so stirring. And imagine that this is the culmination of a man who has spent his life fighting communism. He is standing in the heart of communism saying, this is the way that you need to go. The fact that the Soviets let that speech happen is really stunning, because it was a moment that I think, there are many moments that obviously end the Cold War. But a short time later, the Berlin Wall falls. Short time later, the Soviet Union collapses. And the combination of all of those things together seem to be summed up in that speech talking about freedom to those young Soviet students. I learned a lot about Reagan and things that I didn't know. And I think that the nuggets and stories in this book have just not seen the light of day. The reason I wrote the Eisenhower book and the reason I wrote this book, to introduce leaders of a new generation, to a new generation, even to a generation that thought they knew Reagan very well. I think you will learn things and hear things in this that you will not have seen before. This time the publisher, William Morrow, a subset of HarperCollins, asked me if I wanted to have a young reader's edition come out at the same time. And so we worked on it, and we got this young reader's edition that's ages 8 to 14. It's the same book, same narrative, but just in that speak. They tell me they're going to order them here at the store, but my kids are reading this book at the same time. And that's really why I did this. I think that leaders, certain leaders, are definitely ones to focus back on, because history can tell us so much about our future. We can learn a lot. As John mentioned, obviously the situation today is very different, but the threats are similar. There was a piece that said that I was suggesting that President Trump is the second coming of President Reagan. That is not what I said. To be clear, I said they were very different personalities, and that Trump is not Reagan and Reagan is not Trump. I said that they handle things differently, and obviously the humility part of President Reagan is not one that is high on the scale, but they have the opportunity, or President Trump has the opportunity, to look back at some of the things that President Reagan did. And as I was interviewing Secretary of State Shultz, he listed, how President Reagan was in these summits, that he knew what he wanted, that he was inherently sure of it. And because of that, he had the upper hand in the negotiations. There are things to learn from the past. And while that one article was completely wrong, I do see similarities in the threats they face. And some of the big speeches that President Trump has delivered, I think he is, and his speechwriters have tried to echo President Reagan. The Warsaw, Poland speech, the speech in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the speech at the State of the Union, the United Nations. There are lines in there that I think you can hear the echoes of President Reagan. So with that, I want to say thank you all for coming out. It's been a real pleasure, and my kids had a blast running around this place today. We had a great time doing the show from out here. I aspire to do at least one more book that's in the works, and I'm going to save that for a little tease for the next time. I want to answer a couple questions. I don't think it's in your list, but I'm going to answer this before we start. Charles Krauthammer. Everybody always asks me about Charles Krauthammer. I have a good report that he has turned the corner. He's had a series of surgeries. There was a time when he was not doing well. And he's a panelist, for those who don't know, a longtime syndicated columnist, my dear friend, and he is doing much better. And we hope to see him on the panel very soon. I'm in communications with him. 2, Shannon Bream, Is That Beautiful, inside and out. 3, nobody gets in fights with Juan Williams at the commercial breaks. 4, yes, I did feel like a piece of prime rib in a lion's den on The View with Joy Behar and Whoopi Goldberg, but I survived unscathed. And 5, Special Report is cooking, and we're just trying to drink from the fire hose of news, and we appreciate you tuning in. 3 p.m. your time, but hopefully you stick it on the DVR and record it. With that, I'll take your questions, John.
A number of you were kind enough to ask a question or two that I've got, and some of these are great. Okay, Bret, you had 3 days book involving Eisenhower. Now you have 3 days book involving President Reagan. I guess we get past the T's here. What's your next 3 days book?
So it'll be in the same Cold War vein. It'll be a leader, and we're already working on it.
Bret,
How many syllables? Yeah.
Okay. Well, after all the research, now that your book is done, what is the one unanswered question that you might still have?
That's a great question. You know, I guess what would have happened if Reagan was around today and how he would look at things today. You know, I can guess by his past, but it'd be really great to just have him here to commentate on the world and be pretty special.
The Berlin Wall fell a year after President Reagan left office. How much credit do you believe President Reagan deserves for the fall of the wall?
Well, I think a lot. There are a lot of people who obviously deserve credit, but I think that this book will demonstrate that it was his life. He worked with a lot of people, Margaret Thatcher, the Pope, Lech Walesa. I mean, a lot of people deserve credit, but he is a seminal figure in that. And I think what was beautiful, and this is always also in there, when the wall comes down, that George H.W. Bush did not choose to tout it or to tap dance on the wall falling. He was very cautious and actually deferred to Gorbachev in a way that was that improved their relationship going forward. Gorbachev obviously was falling in popularity. His economy, perestroika, you know, the people there, they didn't see perestroika in the refrigerator. And there was a real battle for leadership. But George H.W. Bush taking that helm afterwards was a significant moment.
This ties in. Mikhail Gorbachev won the Nobel Prize for helping to end the Cold War. President Reagan did not. Do you feel Ronald Reagan should have won the Nobel Prize?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Michael Reagan says yes. Yeah, I mean 100%.
You talked about the speech, the visit to Moscow University. Did you talk to any students that were there when President Reagan delivered his speech?
So we tried desperately to find students in that audience, working with researchers overseas, and we could not track them down. We also tried to interview Gorbachev, and he did an op-ed back in January about how President Trump and Vladimir Putin should get together and fight expanding nuclear power, but we could not sit down with him either. But if there was a wish that I felt like I really wanted was just to talk to one of those students. Because what I didn't talk about is after the speech is done, President Reagan takes Q&A from those students. Not like this, where they're writing them down and submitted questions, just impromptu Q&A from Soviet students in a foreign land in the heart of communism. You know, if anybody thought he was off his game, he wasn't at that point.
There's been a huge turnover at Fox in the past few years in terms of its...
So back to the Moscow State University. There's more to talk about there. I've got more to say on that. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, you'll like the end.
Okay,
you'll like the ending of this question. There's been a huge turnover at Fox in the past few years in terms of its nightly lineup. Only Sean Hannity remains. Yet viewership seems to be just as strong. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's an equation that works, and people have come to trust both the news and opinion. It's a question. There's a hunger for a different point of view on the opinion side, to hear that. On the news side, I really do think there's a hunger for people to say, look at one program and say, okay, I got it, you know, and hear all sides, but in a way that is the old school news way, which is just presenting it. And hopefully that we're doing that. And I think that's why if you build it, they will come.
It's a good one. A lot of people feel that the reason Americans are so polarized these days is because news organizations like Fox, MSNBC, CNN, have taken sides and are polarized themselves. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, clearly on the opinion side, there's different takes, and there are different looks at the same situation. I mean, you look at the same set of facts and see something completely different. On the news side, I put my horse blinders on from 6 to 7 Eastern and try to think of it like I'm presenting to whomever, no matter your ideology, the facts of the day. There's enough news out there that we don't have to hype it up on either side ideologically. But let me just say that the opinion folks, they do a great job at what they do. And all of them. I work in the office next to Tucker, and I told him, yeah, Tucker Carlson. He's a fantastic guy. He's just as funny in person. And I told him recently, Tucker, you're going to run out of young liberals who've never seen your show. He's a little harsh on him sometimes. And he said, no, I won't.
You have moderated major presidential debates. Do you ever get nervous?
It's funny. At the moment of a debate, you are so focused on the questions that you've worked on. And those questions take a lot of time to hone. We are trying to get them down to where candidates don't have an off-ramp to their regular talking points, so that you figure out and you pre-build into the question, I know you're going to say X, Y, and Z, but answer this. And they still say X, Y, and Z, but you try to really focus on the question. So to answer your question, they're big moments, and you do get a little butterfly, but when the red light goes on, it's kind of like game on. Yeah.
Related, which candidate has most impressed you? Which has least impressed you?
Well, that's a tough one. Listen, from a purely political, like you can't believe it happened, Donald Trump as a candidate is really something that we have never seen ever. Ever. And, covering the campaign, it was really amazing. Like, he would have a big stadium filled with 20,000 people, and I would talk to the Clinton folks, and I'd say, well, what do you think about that? And she had an event the same night that was like 1,500 people. And they came back to me and said, well, she likes more intimate crowds. I'm like, I don't know about that. I'd probably take the 20,000, I think. So as a phenomena, I think candidate Trump has been something to watch. I'll be interested to see how that, if he changes it all. Something tells me he won't. As other candidates go, we could be seeing on the Democratic side another 17 to 20 candidates. And you tell me, who is the leader of the Democratic Party currently for 2020? Like, who is taking the mantle right now? I think that's a fascinating thing to ask as we get ready to go to the midterms. And I think it's going to be playing out in the next few months.
Do you ever watch MSNBC or CNN?
I do. I do watch it. I have 4 TVs in my office, and I'm constantly watching the other competition. There's a few shows I like more than others, but I do watch. And I do check in what everybody's doing.
Do you think President Trump should agree to be interviewed by the special counsel, or do you think it's a trap?
Back to that Moscow State University speech. Here's what President Trump should do. He should agree to be interviewed on special report. Because I request every week, and this is something that people don't get. You know, they say, oh, he's so friendly with Fox. Well, the news side of Fox requests to interview him every week. It's 562 days, not that I'm counting, since I interviewed candidate Trump 10 days before the election. And I've seen him since in off-the-record situations, you know, and he'll say, we're definitely going to do it. It's going to be huge. Fantastic. Definitely going to do it soon, Bret, I promise you. It's going to be great. I don't get to do that on the show either. But, so between Reagan and Trump, I think my Trump might be a little better.
Time for one last question. This kind of me. Did you ever think you'd make it this far in the news business?
You know what I tell students? First of all, I started in small market TV in Hilton Head, South Carolina, for a station in Beaufort that I covered loggerhead sea turtle nesting and what color the azaleas were going to be in the median, like big stories like that. And I bounced around small market TV. I was in Rockford, Illinois, an NBC affiliate for 10 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Really loved Rockford. Raleigh, North Carolina, and I started with Fox when Fox started. The Atlanta Bureau started in my apartment with a fax machine and a cell phone. So what I tell kids when I'm talking to them, journalism classes, I say, okay, you're a car, and you're going down the road, it's nighttime, and your headlights really aren't that good. They're dim, and you can barely make out the road, but you're driving. And then eventually you get some high beams, and you can see more of the road, and you still are driving. And then eventually the sun comes up and you can kind of see the hills and valleys ahead. And you're still driving. And then before you know it, you're there. Now, you didn't know how you were going to get there, but you always kept it on the road to go. And that's what I tell kids, is just keep driving. Because eventually you're going to end up there. And it's a great place to be. So listen, let me just take a second to say thank you to John, to Joanne, to your entire team. It's really been an honor and a pleasure. You wouldn't believe how good their people are about finding documents and photos and helping in every single way. So it's a real honor to work with you folks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
And thanks for the lottery ticket. Thank you all. Is that good?